Richard Auclair signed the divorce papers with a smirk, convinced he was discarding a broken woman who would fade into obscurity without his money or his name. He believed Isabella was merely a passenger in his life, easily replaced and forgotten. But Richard forgot the most dangerous rule of power. Never underestimate the person who built your throne. Tonight, Isabella isn't just returning to the world that rejected her. She is arriving in a vintage Rolls-Royce to prove that she wasn't the passenger. She was the engine. The pen scratched against the heavy cream-colored bond paper, a sound that seemed deafening in the silence of the conference room. It was a Mont Blanc, Richard's favorite, of course. He never missed an opportunity to flaunt a symbol of status, even when dismantling a 15-year marriage. Isabella Sterling sat on the opposite side of the mahogany table, her back as straight as a steel rod. She wasn't crying. That was what irritated Richard the most. He had expected tears. He had expected hysterics, pleading, perhaps a dramatic faint. He had prepared his attorney, Arthur Blackwood, for a scene. He had even practiced his pitying look in the mirror that morning, the look that said, "It's not you, darling. It's just that I've outgrown you." But Isabella just sat there. She was wearing a navy dress he had bought her 3 years ago, one he had always criticized for being too modest. Today, it looked like armor. Sign here and initial the bottom of page 42. Blackwood droned, his voice devoid of empathy. He was a predator in a three-piece suit, charging $600 an hour to dismantle Isabella's life. Isabella picked up the pen. Her hand didn't shake. "Are you sure you understand the terms, Isabella?" Richard asked, leaning back in his leather chair. He swirled the ice in his crystal tumbler of scotch. It was 11 a.m. on a Tuesday. "Once you sign this, the penthouse on Park Avenue is gone. The Hamptons estate is gone. The monthly allowance gone. You're walking away with the settlement we agreed upon, which frankly won't sustain the lifestyle you're accustomed to for very long." He paused, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "I'm just worried about you, Bella. The real world is cold." Isabella looked up, her green eyes cutting through his facade. For the first time in years, Richard felt a flicker of unease. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like someone waking up from a long, suffocating coma. "The cold is preferable to the suffocation of your warmth, Richard," she said softly. Her voice was rusty and used. She signed the paper. Isabella Sterling. She dropped the name Auclair right there on the table, discarding it like a soiled napkin. Richard scoffed, draining his drink. "So dramatic. Camille is waiting downstairs. She wanted to come up, offer her condolences, but I told her it wouldn't be appropriate." The mention of the name was a calculated dagger. Camille de Rothschild, 24 years old, a former intern at Auclair Holdings, and the woman currently wearing diamonds that Isabella had helped Richard pick out for their 10th anniversary. "Tell Camille," Isabella said, standing and smoothing her skirt, "that the position of Mrs. Auclair comes with a lot of hidden duties. I hope she has the stamina for them." She turned to leave. "You're making a mistake, Bella," Richard called after her, his ego bruised by her lack of devastation. "You're 42 years old. You have no career. You have no connections that aren't mine. You'll be managing a bookstore in Brooklyn within a month." Isabella paused at the frosted glass doors. She didn't look back. "Goodbye, Richard." The elevator ride down from the 55th floor of Rockefeller Center felt like a descent into the unknown. But when the doors opened to the lobby, Isabella gasped. It wasn't despair. It was oxygen. Outside it was pouring rain, a classic New York deluge. She walked out of the revolving doors. There was Richard's limousine parked at the curb. The window rolled down, and she saw Camille's face. Beautiful, young, and smug. Camille offered a tiny, pitying wave. Richard emerged from the building behind Isabella, snapping his fingers at his driver. "To Tiffany's, James. Camille needs a pick-me-up." Isabella stood on the sidewalk, the rain instantly soaking her navy dress. She had no umbrella. She had no car waiting. She watched as her husband of 15 years got into the car with his mistress, the heavy door thudding shut with a sound of finality. The limousine peeled away, splashing dirty puddle water onto Isabella's heels. She stood there for a long minute, shivering. A doorman from the building, a man she had nodded to for years named Henry, stepped out with a large umbrella. "Mrs. Auclair." "I mean, ma'am." Henry asked gently, holding the canopy over her. "Shall I hail a cab?" Isabella looked at him. Tears finally welled in her eyes, mixing with the rain. Not tears of loss, but the terrifying tears of a restart. "No, Henry," she whispered. "I think I'll walk to the subway. I need to learn how to do this again." She turned and walked into the gray storm. Richard thought he had ruined her. He thought he had stripped her of her value. But as she walked toward the 47th Street station, clutching her purse, which contained a check for a modest settlement and her freedom, Isabella Sterling made a silent vow. "He thinks I was a passenger in his life. He's about to find out I was the engine." 8 months later, the bell above the door of the Gilded Page chimed softly. It was a small, dusty, but charming antique bookshop in the West Village. It smelled of old paper, vanilla, and worn wood, a scent Isabella had come to love. "Isabella, can you handle the register? I have to check the shipment in the back." Mrs. Gable, the shop's owner, called out from the storeroom. Mrs. Gable was 70, partially deaf, and the kindest woman Isabella had ever met. "On it, Margaret." Isabella called back. She wiped her hands on her apron. She wasn't wearing Chanel anymore. She was wearing a soft beige knit sweater from Zara and jeans. Her hair, once blown out daily at a salon on Fifth Avenue, was pulled back in a loose, messy bun. She looked younger. The stress lines around her mouth, etched by years of walking on eggshells around Richard, had softened. She walked to the counter to assist the customer. "Good afternoon. Welcome to the Gilded Page. How can I?" Isabella froze. Standing on the other side of the counter was not a regular customer looking for a first edition Dickens. It was a ghost from her past life. "Isabella." The voice was stunned. It was Caroline Whitaker, the wife of the CEO of J.P. Morgan. They had sat on the board of the Botanical Garden Gala together for 5 years. Caroline was dressed in Fendi, holding a rare architectural digest. Isabella felt heat rise up her neck. This was the moment she had dreaded. The discovery. "Hello, Caroline," Isabella said, keeping her voice steady, lifting her chin. Caroline's eyes scanned Isabella's outfit, then darted around the small, slightly cluttered shop. Her expression shifted from shock to something resembling horror, then settled into a patronizing pity. "Oh my God, Richard said you were taking some time," Caroline whispered, leaning in as if being modest was contagious. "But I didn't realize you were working retail." "I enjoy it," Isabella said coolly. "I love books. I'm helping manage the inventory." Of course," Caroline said, patting Isabella's hand over the counter. "It's brave. So brave. Look, darling, are you okay? Do you need help?" "I am perfectly fine, Caroline. That book is $150. Would you like it wrapped?" Caroline bought the book largely out of awkwardness and practically fled the store. Isabella knew what would happen next. By dinner time, every phone on the Upper East Side would be buzzing. "Did you hear? Isabella Auclair is a shop girl. Poor thing. Richard really left her with nothing." Isabella took a deep breath and leaned against the counter. She closed her eyes. Let them talk. The door chimed again. Isabella straightened up, pasting on a smile. "Welcome to the Gilded Page." A man walked in. He was tall, wearing a charcoal gray overcoat that fit him a little too well to be off the rack, but it was worn, the collar slightly frayed. He had dark hair touched with silver at the temples, and eyes the color of slate, gray and unreadable. He carried himself with a quiet, heavy stillness. He didn't look like the frantic, status-obsessed men Isabella used to know. He looked like a man who worked with his hands, perhaps a high-end contractor or a specialist craftsman. "I'm looking for a specific book," he said. His voice was deep gravelly. "A 1920s repair manual for a distinct engine type. The Rolls-Royce Phantom OI. It's a long shot." Isabella's mind clicked. She knew exactly where it was. She had cataloged it last week, wondering who on earth would want a century-old mechanic's guide. "Third shelf on the left, bottom row," Isabella said immediately. "Blue spine, the spirit of maintenance. It's in surprisingly good condition." The man looked at her, surprised. One eyebrow raised. "You know your inventory." "I know every book in this shop," she replied. He walked to the shelf, retrieved the book, and flipped through it. A small, genuine smile touched his lips. It changed his face completely. making him look younger, less guarded. He brought it to the counter. "You have no idea how long I've been looking for this," he said. "I'm restoring an old beauty. She's been sitting in a garage in Jersey for 40 years. This is the missing piece." "It sounds like a labor of love," Isabella said, ringing him up. $45. He handed her a $50 bill. His hands were rough, calloused, but his nails were clean. "Keep the change." "We don't do tips, sir," Isabella said, handing him a $5 bill. "But thank you." He paused, looking at her properly for the first time. He seemed to study her face, not with the predatory gaze of the men at the country club, but with a curiosity that made Isabella's heart skip a beat. "I'm Silas," he said. "Isabella." "Well, Isabella, thank you. You just saved a very expensive piece of machinery from becoming scrap metal." He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "You know, for a bookstore clerk, you have the posture of a duchess." Isabella laughed, a short, dry sound. "Former duchess, current clerk." Silas didn't ask. He just nodded, tipped his head, and walked out into the crisp autumn air. Isabella watched him go. It was the first pleasant interaction she'd had with a man in 8 months. 2 weeks later, the invitation arrived. It wasn't mailed to her apartment in Brooklyn. It was hand-delivered to the bookstore, addressed to Miss Isabella Sterling. It was a heavy cream envelope with gold embossing. "The Sterling Eau Claire Foundation Annual Charity Gala, requesting the pleasure of your company." Isabella stared at it. The foundation. She had started it. She had built it from the ground up, organizing auctions, vetting charities, raising millions for children's literacy. When they divorced, Richard's lawyers had argued that the foundation was an asset of Eau Claire Holdings. She had been forced to resign from the board. Why was he inviting her? Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Thought you might want to see what we've done with the place. Unless you're too busy shelving paperbacks." Richard. It was a taunt. He wanted her to come so he could parade Camille around as the new chairwoman of the foundation. He wanted to show the world that Isabella was fully replaced, that she would show up in a worn dress looking tired and defeated. To kiss the ring. Bad news. Mrs. Gable asked, seeing Isabella's pale face. "A summons. More like a trap," Isabella muttered. She moved to throw the invitation in the trash. "Don't," Mrs. Gable said sharply. Isabella froze. "You built that foundation, didn't you? I remember reading about it years ago. You're that Isabella." "I was." "If you don't go," Mrs. Gable said, polishing a brass lamp, "you're telling him he was right. You're telling him you don't exist anymore." "I can't go, Margaret. I don't have a gown. I don't have jewelry. I don't have a way to get there. I take the subway now. You can't arrive at an event like that in a subway car." The bell chimed. It was Silas. He was wearing a mechanic's jumpsuit this time, bearing the logo Mercer Restorations. He looked tired, a smudge of grease on his cheek. "Back again?" Isabella asked, trying to hide the invitation behind her back. "I need a book on upholstery leather stitching," Silas said. He looked at her, sensing the tension. "Everything okay?" Isabella looked at the stranger. She didn't know why, but the frustration bubbled over. "My ex-husband," she blurted out, "is throwing a gala for the charity I started, and he invited me just to humiliate me. And the worst part is, I want to go. I want to walk in there and show him I'm still standing. But I can't." Silas leaned against the counter. The air around him felt solid, dependable. "Why can't you?" "Because in that world, Silas, appearance is everything. I need a gown, diamonds, and a car that doesn't smell like wet dog. I have none of those things." Silas looked at her thoughtfully. He glanced at the grease on his hands, then back at her eyes. "I can't help you with the dress," Silas said slowly. "But I know cars. Mercer Restorations handles high-end fleets, vintage Rolls-Royces, Bentleys. Sometimes we chauffeur them for events to make sure the engines are handled correctly." Isabella blinked. "You drive them?" "I can," Silas said. He shrugged. "I have a 1935 Rolls-Royce Phantom getting finished this week. Jet black, suicide doors. It's fit for royalty. It needs a test run." He leaned in closer. "You get the dress, Isabella. I'll make sure you arrive in a way that turns every head." Isabella stared at him. It was impulsive. He was a customer, a mechanic. But there was a glint in his eye. A challenge. Why would you do that? She whispered. Silas smiled, a crooked, dangerous smile. Because I've dealt with men like your ex-husband my whole life, and I love seeing them lose. The rain had turned the Brooklyn skyline into a smear of charcoal and gray, matching the turbulence inside Isabella's small walk-up apartment. The invitation lay on her kitchen counter like a radioactive object, radiating quiet malice. On the night of the gala, Isabella stood before her closet. It was a humbling sight compared to the walk-in dressing room she had left behind on Park Avenue. There were no rows of seasonal Prada, no color-coordinated sections of cashmere, just a rack of sensible work clothes and a few plastic bins shoved into the corner. Richard had been meticulous during the asset division. He had kept the jewelry, family heirlooms, he claimed, though he had bought them for her. He had kept the furs. He had even argued over the designer gowns, claiming they were purchased with company funds for public relations events. She had left with 2 suitcases of basics. He wants me to fail, she whispered to the empty room. He wants me to show up in a department store cocktail dress, so he can introduce me to his investors as his unfortunate past. She knelt down and pulled out a dusty plastic bin from the back of the closet. It was marked University Paris, 1998. Isabella hadn't opened this box in 20 years. Richard had hated her discussing her time studying art history in Paris. He found it bohemian and unrefined. He preferred the narrative that she had merely existed, waiting for him to rescue her. The approach to the Metropolitan Museum of Art was a gridlock of wealth. A procession of black Cadillac Escalades and stretch Lincolns snaked around the block, idling as they waited to deposit the city's elite onto the red carpet draped over the iconic steps. Flashbulbs popped incessantly, a strobe effect that illuminated the misty rain. Inside the warmth of the Rolls-Royce, the world felt unhurried. Isabella watched through the tinted glass as people she had known for 15 years stepped out of their cars. There was the banking commissioner. There was the editor of Vogue. They all looked identical, polished, safe, uniform. With 3 cars out, Silas said over the intercom. His voice was calm, grounding her. I'm terrified, Isabella admitted to the empty cabin. Look at Richard, Silas said gently. Do you see him? Isabella squinted. Near the top of the stairs, standing under the massive awning, was Richard. He was holding court. He wore a velvet tuxedo jacket, too fashionable for his age, and Camille was draped on his arm. Camille was wearing white feathers and diamonds, looking like a debutante at her first ball. Richard was checking his watch, his face etched with impatience. He was waiting for Isabella to fail. He was waiting for her to not show up, or to arrive in a yellow taxi. I see him, Isabella said, her voice hardening. He looks small from here, doesn't he? Silas remarked. The car in front of them, a gaudy gold-wrapped Lamborghini, finally moved off. Showtime, Silas murmured. He didn't pull up quickly. He let the Rolls-Royce creep forward, the massive black fenders parting the air. The sheer scale of the car, its vintage silhouette, was so alien in the sea of modern SUVs that the crowd fell silent before the car even stopped. The engine cut. Silence. The paparazzi lowered their cameras for a split second, confused. This wasn't a celebrity rental. This was something older, rarer. This was wealth that didn't shout. It murmured. Silas didn't open the door immediately. He waited. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. The tension outside grew. Richard had stopped talking. He was staring down the steps, frowning, trying to identify who had arrived in a vehicle worth more than his entire portfolio. Camille was craning her neck. Then the driver's door opened. Silas stepped out. He buttoned his tuxedo jacket with one fluid motion. He walked around the back of the massive car, his posture impeccable, his face a mask of professional calm. He ignored the press. He ignored the valet, who tried to approach. He reached the rear passenger door, the suicide door. He placed his hand on the handle. He paused, looking up at Richard at the top of the stairs. Silas locked eyes with the ex-husband, holding the gaze for a heartbeat. A challenge thrown across 50 feet of red carpet. Watch closely. Silas pulled the handle. The heavy door swung backward, revealing the illuminated interior. First, the leg. Pale skin, the sharp arch of the foot, a simple black stiletto heel striking the red carpet with a deliberate click. Then Isabella rose. As she stepped out of the darkness of the car into the flashing lights, the crimson silk caught the glare of the paparazzi bulbs and rippled like liquid fire. The backless cut exposed her spine, straight and proud. She stood there for a moment, adjusting to the light. The wind caught a loose tendril of her hair. The silence was absolute. Camille's smile faltered. The feathers on her dress suddenly looked theatrical, like a costume. Richard's glass of champagne tilted dangerously in his hand. Isabella didn't look at the cameras. She turned to Silas. Silas bowed his head slightly. Not a servant's bow, but a partner's acknowledgement. "I'll have the engine running, Miss Sterling." "Thank you, Silas," she said, her voice carrying in the quiet. She turned to the stairs. A murmur broke out among the press. "Who is that? Is that the Eau Claire wife? My God, look at the dress. Where did she get the car?" The flashbulbs erupted, a blinding wall of white light, 10 times more intense than what Richard had received. They weren't photographing a discarded wife. They were photographing a mystery, a woman who had been cast aside and came back leading the pack. Isabella began to climb the stairs. She walked slowly. She didn't rush toward Richard. She forced him to wait. She forced him to watch her ascend step by step, while the entire city of New York watched with him. When she finally reached the top landing, she stopped 2 feet in front of him. Richard looked as if he had been struck in the chest. His eyes moved over her. The dress, the absence of jewelry, the luminous skin, the terrifying composure. He looked for the cracks. He looked for the poverty he had inflicted on her. He found nothing but strength. "Isabella," he choked out. It was less a greeting and more a question of reality. Isabella offered a cool, thin smile. She glanced at Camille, then back to Richard. "Richard." She nodded. "Lovely setup. The floral arrangements are a bit chaotic, but I suppose that's the new aesthetic." She didn't wait for a response. She stepped around him, moving toward the grand doors of the museum. Richard grabbed her arm, a violation of the unspoken social contract. "Who does the car belong to, Isabella? Who are you involved with?" He hissed, his face flushing red. Isabella looked down at his hand on her arm until he released it, embarrassed. "That's the difference between us, Richard," she said, her voice low enough that only he and Camille could hear. "You believe power comes from who you own or who you sleep with." She leaned in, her perfume, something spicy and unfamiliar, filling his senses. "I didn't need anyone to get here. I just finally remembered who I was before I met you." She turned and walked into the great hall, the crimson train of her dress following her like a ribbon of flame, leaving Richard standing in the rain, looking very expensive and very, very small. Inside, the gala had already begun, but as Isabella entered, the room shifted. Conversations ceased. Heads turned. Arthur Blackwood, the shark lawyer, dropped his canopy. Isabella took a glass of champagne from a passing tray. She stood alone in the center of the room, beneath the temple of Dender. She had no husband. She had no fortune. But as the whispers began to circulate, Isabella took a sip and tasted something she hadn't tasted in 15 years. Victory. She didn't know it yet, but outside, inside the idling Rolls-Royce, Silas was on the phone. "Yes," Silas said, watching the museum entrance. "She's inside. The target is Richard Eau Claire. Execute phase 2 of the acquisition. I want his stock declining by the time dessert is served." He hung up, his gray eyes narrowing. He wasn't just a mechanic, and he wasn't just a chauffeur. Richard Eau Claire had made many enemies on his climb to the top, but he had never made an enemy of the Sterling family. And he had certainly never encountered Silas Sterling, Isabella's estranged cousin, the venture capitalist who had been exiled to London 20 years ago and had just returned to settle the family's debts. Isabella didn't know it yet, but she wasn't just walking into a party. She was walking into a takeover. The Temple of Dender inside the Metropolitan Museum was bathed in soft amber light, casting long ancient shadows against the sandstone walls. The air was thick with expensive perfume, stale champagne, and quiet judgment. Isabella moved through the crowd like a woman haunting her own life. She recognized every face. There was Eleanor Vance, who had attended Isabella's baby shower for the child she had miscarried. There was Julian Thorpe, the banker who had managed the Eau Claire accounts. As Isabella passed, conversations didn't just pause. They fractured. Eyes darted to her backless crimson dress, then to her face, searching for the breakdown Richard had quietly promised them she was experiencing. Isabella. Eleanor Vance's voice was high and brittle. She stepped in front of Isabella, blocking her path near the hors d'oeuvres. We didn't expect to see you. Richard said you were in recovery. Isabella paused, her grip on her clutch tightening just enough to turn her knuckles white. Recovery implies illness, Eleanor. I'm simply in transition. Right, of course, Eleanor stammered, her eyes scanning Isabella's lack of jewelry. It's just seeing you here, it's brave. Very brave. Especially with Camille running the auction tonight. Courage has nothing to do with it, Isabella replied, her voice smooth and measured. I built this foundation. I don't need permission to visit my own creation. She stepped around Eleanor, leaving the woman flustered, but the relief was short-lived. Across the room, Richard had spotted her again. He had consumed 2 more scotches since the red carpet. The humiliation of her arrival was gnawing at him, dismantling his carefully maintained image as the gracious, long-suffering ex-husband. He whispered to the head of security, a broad man named Gorman, and pointed directly at Isabella. Gorman began moving through the crowd toward her. Isabella's heart hammered. He's going to have me removed. In front of everyone. She looked around for an exit, her breath catching. She was alone. The adrenaline of the entrance was fading, replaced by the cold reality that she was a bookstore clerk at a billionaire's event. Miss Sterling, Gorman said, stepping into her space. He was polite but firm. Mr. Auclair has requested that you relocate. There is a concern that your presence is causing a disturbance. I have an invitation, Isabella said, her voice trembling slightly. It's a private event. The host retains the right to refuse entry. Please don't make a scene. Richard was watching from the bar, a satisfied smirk on his face. He raised his glass to her. Checkmate. Isabella felt tears stinging the back of her eyes. This was it. The final humiliation. Take your hand off her. The voice didn't come from the crowd. It came from the main entrance of the hall. It was a voice that carried the weight of a gavel striking a bench. Gorman turned. Richard froze. Silas was walking into the room. He wasn't wearing a chauffeur's cap. He was walking with the quiet assurance of a man who owned the floorboards beneath his feet. He moved through the parting crowd, ignoring the murmurs. Who are you? Gorman asked, stepping between Isabella and Silas. Staff are not permitted in the main hall. Richard stormed over, his face darkening. This is her driver. Good God, Isabella, have you no dignity? Bringing the hired help inside. He turned to Gorman. Remove them both. Now. Silas didn't look at Gorman. He looked at Richard. He stepped closer, standing over the ex-husband by 3 inches. The air between them seemed to drop 10 degrees. I'm not the help, Richard, Silas said quietly. He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket and produced a sleek black envelope. He held it out. I'm the donor. Richard blinked. What? The platinum table, Silas said, his tone bored. Table 1. The anonymous contribution of $500,000 that funded tonight's dinner. That was me. The room went completely silent. You're a mechanic, Richard sputtered, his mind failing to process the information. I saw your hands. You were driving the car. I enjoy cars, Silas said with a shrug. And I enjoy driving. It settles my mind before acquisitions. Silas turned to Isabella, his eyes softening. He offered her his arm. I believe our table is ready, Miss Sterling. Right at the front. Isabella looked at him, her thoughts reeling. Who are you? She screamed internally, but outwardly she simply took his arm. It was an anchor in the storm. Yes, she whispered. Let's sit. As they walked past Richard, Silas paused. He leaned in, his voice a blade wrapped in silk. By the way, Richard, you should check your phone. I think you're trending. Dinner was a blur of rattled waiters and aggressive whispers. Isabella and Silas sat at table 1, center stage. It was the table traditionally reserved for Richard and his board of directors, but the placard simply read the Sterling Trust. Richard and Camille had been placed at table 2. Off to the side, Camille was visibly furious, stabbing at her salad. Richard was sweating, checking his phone under the table every 30 seconds. Eat, Silas said gently, nudging a plate of sea bass toward Isabella. You'll need the energy. Silas, Isabella hissed, leaning in. What is going on? You repair engines. You bought a $40 book on repair manuals. How did you donate $500,000? Silas lifted his wine glass, studied the deep red liquid, and swirled it. I told you I was away for a long time, he said softly. I didn't say I was idle. My father, your uncle, left me nothing but debts. I went to London and built something from the ashes. A venture capital firm, Chimera Global. Isabella gasped. Everyone knew Chimera. It was a formidable firm with a reputation for hostile takeovers of struggling luxury brands. Ruthless, surgical, the wolves of the corporate world. You are Chimera. I am the majority partner, Silas corrected. And for the last 6 months, while you were learning the inventory of that bookstore, I was analyzing the inventory of Eau Claire Holdings. Isabella stared at him. Why? Why didn't you tell me? Because you needed to find your own footing first, Silas said, looking into her eyes. If I had intervened on day one, you would still be defined by him. Tonight, you stood up on your own. You're not a victim anymore, Isabella. You're a partner. A spoon clinked against a glass. Richard was at the podium. He looked pale. His tie was slightly crooked. He gripped the microphone stand as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard's voice boomed, though it wavered. Thank you for coming. Tonight is about legacy. It's about building a future. He attempted a smile, but his eyes kept shifting around the room. Eau Claire Holdings has always been a pillar of stability. We value family. A distinct notification sound rang through the hall. Then another. Then a wave of vibrations swept across tables. The noise that followed wasn't applause. It was the sound of 300 wealthy investors checking their Bloomberg terminals simultaneously. Richard faltered. As I was saying. Oh my God. A woman at table 4 whispered loudly. It's collapsing. Sell it. Sell now. Dump everything. A man at table 6 barked into his phone, abandoning all decorum. Richard stopped speaking. Excuse me. Isabella looked at Silas. Silas was calmly buttering a bread roll. What is happening? She whispered. The news just broke, Silas said. A financial report was just released regarding Eau Claire Holdings. It details the falsified sustainability documentation in the supply chain, the concealed debt in offshore accounts, and the impending class action lawsuit from shareholders. Who released it? Isabella asked, stunned. Silas took a measured bite of bread. I did. On stage, Richard's phone rang loudly. He pulled it out, saw the screen, and went gray. I have to. Richard stammered into the microphone. There seems to be a technical difficulty. It's not technical, Richard. A man stood near the back. It was Arthur Blackwood, his own attorney. The stock is down 40% in 10 minutes. We are bleeding out. Chaos broke through the room. Waiters were jostled aside as financiers rushed for the exits to make emergency calls. The gala dissolved into a trading floor in full panic. Silas wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. He stood. He buttoned his jacket with one hand. He didn't use a microphone. He didn't need to. Richard. The room froze. Richard looked down from the stage, his expression wild and unraveling. You're searching for a lifeline, Silas said, walking steadily toward the stage. But no institution in this city will extend you one. Your assets are frozen. Your liquidity is gone. You are effectively insolvent. Silas stopped at the base of the stairs. However, he continued, reaching into his pocket and unfolding a document. There's one offer on the table. A buyout. Richard stared at him. Who are you? Silas climbed the first step. I represent the Sterling Trust. We are prepared to purchase the controlling interest of Eau Claire Holdings at the current market price. He glanced at his watch, which is roughly $3 a share. Isabella stood. The realization struck her like a current. The Sterling Trust. Silas wasn't just dismantling Richard. He was acquiring the company back and placing it in her name. You cannot do this, Richard cried, sweat running down his face. This is my company. I built this. No, Silas said flatly, climbing the final step to stand beside the man. You married into the capital that built this, and then you discarded the woman who gave it to you. Silas turned to the assembled crowd. He gestured toward Isabella, standing alone at the center of the room, a beacon of crimson in a sea of black. "I am acquiring this company," Silas announced, "but I will not be operating it. I am the capital. The chief executive position will be restored to the person who actually understands the soul of this foundation." He looked at Richard. "Sign the documents, Richard, or face prosecution for fraud. Those are your options." Richard looked at Camille. Camille was already gone. She had slipped out a side entrance the moment the stock began to fall. Defeated, hollow, and utterly alone, Richard accepted the pen Silas offered. Isabella watched as her ex-husband signed away his empire at the podium of his own event. She felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned. It was Mrs. Gable from the bookstore, who had somehow slipped past security in her Sunday best, her eyes bright and gleaming. "I told you," Mrs. Gable whispered. "You were never just a clerk, dear." Silas descended the stairs, the signed contract in hand. He walked straight to Isabella. The room held its breath. He held the document out to her. "The car is waiting, Miss Sterling," Silas said, a quiet smile on his lips. "And tomorrow morning you have a board meeting. I suggest we get you home, so you can rest." Isabella took the paper. It was heavy. It carried the weight of 15 years. And just like that, the weight was gone. The morning sun over Manhattan was sharp and unforgiving. It didn't offer the soft haze of the previous night's gala. It exposed everything. At 8:45 a.m., Richard Auclair stood in the lobby of the building that still bore his name in chrome letters above the revolving doors. He was wearing the same tuxedo from the night before, now rumpled and carrying the scent of stale scotch. He hadn't gone home to the penthouse because his key card had been deactivated. He hadn't gone to a hotel because his credit cards had been declined at the Four Seasons at 3 in the morning. He walked toward the elevator bank, head down, hoping to reach his office and salvage whatever he had locked in the safe. "Sir, stop right there." Richard froze. It was Gorman, the head of security, the same man Richard had ordered to remove Isabella just 12 hours ago. Gorman stood with his arms crossed, flanked by 2 additional guards. He didn't look intimidated. He looked tired. "Your pass isn't malfunctioning, Mr. Auclair. It's been deactivated per the directive of the new majority shareholder." "I am the founder of this company," Richard shouted, his voice splintering. The lobby, filled with employees arriving for the day, went quiet. People stared, whispered, held up their phones. The great Richard Auclair, screaming in a tuxedo in the morning light. "You were the founder," a voice said from behind him. "Now you're a liability." Richard turned. The revolving doors slowed to a stop. Walking in was not Silas. It was Isabella. She wore a sharp, tailored white suit, the color of a blank page. Her hair was down, loose and wavy. She didn't look like the woman who had signed divorce papers, with trembling composure, in this very building. She looked like the building belonged to her. Because it did. Silas walked a half-step behind her, back in his mechanic's jumpsuit, carrying a helmet. He had no interest in boardrooms. His work was finished. Isabella stopped in front of Richard. She didn't look angry. She didn't look vindictive. She regarded him with the mild curiosity one reserves for a stranger. "Isabella," Richard gasped, stepping toward her. "Bella, please. You have to stop this. They locked me out of the accounts. Camille took the jewelry and left this morning. I have nothing. I have nowhere to go." He reached for her hand. "We were married for 15 years. Doesn't that mean anything?" Isabella looked at his hand, the hand that had dismissed her, the hand that had signed away her future without a second thought. "It means I know exactly who you are, Richard," she said softly. "You're a man who only loves reflections of himself. And right now you don't have a mirror left." She signaled to Gorman. "Mr. Gorman, please escort Mr. Auclair off the premises. He is disrupting business." "Isabella," Richard cried as Gorman took hold of his arm. "You can't do this. You're a shop girl. You're nothing without me." Isabella didn't flinch. She leaned close, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "You're right, Richard. I was a shop girl, and we're currently hiring in the mailroom. If you fill out an application, I'll put in a good word, but you'll have to start at the bottom." She straightened up. "Like I did." She turned and walked toward the elevators. The staff parted around her. They weren't watching Richard anymore. They were watching their new chief executive. Silas remained in the lobby for a moment, observing Richard being escorted out onto the unforgiving pavement of Fifth Avenue. He walked to the reception desk, where a young receptionist sat stunned and silent. Silas set a single business card on the desk. "If he comes back," Silas said, his gray eyes calm and certain, "call me. I'll bring the car around." He turned and walked out to his Rolls-Royce waiting at the curb. He wasn't staying for the board meeting. His role was complete. He had restored the engine. Now it was up to Isabella to drive. Up on the 55th floor, Isabella walked into the office that had once been Richard's. It carried the scent of his cologne. She crossed to the window and threw it open. The wind rushed in, chaotic and alive, scattering the papers from the desk. She took a deep breath. She picked up the phone on the mahogany desk. "This is Isabella Sterling," she said to her assistant. "Gimme maintenance. I want this office cleared out by noon. And send a check to the Gilded Page bookstore in the West Village. Tell Mrs. Gable her partner is ready to buy the building." She hung up and looked out at the city. Richard had thought the divorce was her end. He hadn't understood that in a story written by a woman who refuses to disappear, a divorce isn't a tragedy. It's a plot twist.